everyone. This is Natalia Rivera from the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. We're really glad that you're able to join us for our final webinar for fall. It's titled Getting Down and Dirty, Everything You Need to Know About Activism. So this is basically a webinar on advocacy and campaign strategies. Sarah Schneider will be our presenter for today. Sarah is the chair of ASON's Board of Trustees, as well as the new media communications organizer for SEIU. Before we begin the webinar, I just want to share some just notes on two resources that are coming up soon. One thing about the written resource that corresponds with this webinar, we will provide a written resource summarizing the advocacy strategies discussed today next week. So heads up on that. And in January, we'll also be releasing a campaign strategy toolkit, which will include some templates on some of the information that will be discussed today. So I'll go ahead and, yep, Sarah, you can go ahead and start presenting.
Okay. So today I'm going to talk a lot about campaign strategy. So that is sort of your plan for getting something done if you want to organize, if you want to make a change in the world. And I just have to figure out how to get the slides to work. Okay. Whoops. Okay. So strategy for a campaign is really about shifting power. That's what organizing and activism is all about. And usually when you start out and you decide on something that you want to change or something that you want to organize around, the power is in the wrong direction. So somebody has power to make a decision, to make a change, but you don't have the power to change their decision yet. So an example of that would be maybe you're dealing with a train station or a bus stop that's not wheelchair accessible, and so that's affecting your daily commute, and you want to do something about that. So in order to make that change, you would need to make a shift in power to make a decision maker make that change for you. So your strategy is the whole plan about how you're going to make that happen. So some of the things we're going to talk about today are issues. The issue is sort of the problem that you want to solve. Your goals, short-term and long-term goals, those are sort of like the intermediate, the stair steps on the way to your final solution that takes care of the problem. Your targets are the people, the decision makers, so the people who have the power to give you what you want. So in our example about the inaccessible public transit, your target might be the head of the transit authority, or it might be the members of the board of the transit authority. Tactics are the specific steps and the actions that you have to take in order to carry out your strategy. So a tactic would be something like passing out a leaflet, or getting a bunch of people to sign a petition or send an email. Those are all tactics. They're ways to put pressure on your target. And then an action plan is sort of like a very detailed plan with timelines and who's responsible for what and when, you know, what happens first and what happens next, and it's the really detailed plan for how you're going to get this all done. So those are the different things we're going to talk about, and then we'll go into a lot more detail about each one. So the first thing is about how to develop a strategy, and sorry the type is so small on this. You guys will get handouts after this is over. It sounds like Natalia said they'll be ready next week that will include not only the content of this presentation, but also a bunch of worksheets that you can use to help work through each of these pieces of the process. So the first step in developing a strategy is identifying your issue. So issues are different from problems, and we'll talk in more detail about that in the next section. A problem is something that's specific and individual, and an issue is something that's systemic and affects a whole group of people. So we'll give some examples of that on the next screen, but in the example I was using about inaccessible transit, the problem might be that you personally have a really long commute because you can't use this one train station, and that's a problem. An issue would be that the transit authority is not complying with the ADA and is not making transit stations accessible to everybody. So it's really just describing your problem in a way that broadens it and makes it affect a larger group of people. The next step in developing a strategy is completing a power analysis, and we'll talk in more detail about that. But a power analysis is where you figure out who your targets are, so who's the decision maker who could make a change and give you what you want, and then what your resources are. What kind of power does your target have, and what kind of power do you have, and where can you find a pressure point or the leverage that you need to get things done. The next step is creating an action plan, and you want your plan to be really detailed, but it also needs to be flexible because things change in the course of an organizing campaign. It might go on for a couple of weeks or for months, and as things change, you need to be ready and prepared to change your plan along with it. When we talk about making an action plan, we'll talk about figuring out what your goals are, your short-term goals and your long-term goals. We'll figure out what your ask is. So the ask is specifically, what are you asking your target to do? It needs to be really specific. It may be you're asking your target to retrofit a specific train station and provide a ramp or a lift or an elevator. Or your ask might be bigger than that. It may be you want your target to agree to increase funding for accessibility in public transit by $1 million in the next fiscal year. But an ask will be really specific so that you know exactly what you're asking your target to do. Tactics, we talked a little bit about that already. Tactics are the things that you're going to do to put pressure on your target. So getting people to sign a petition is a tactic. Passing out flyers is a tactic. Street theater is a tactic. We'll talk more about different kinds of tactics. And then assignments and timelines. If you're organizing together with a group of people, assignments help you know who's doing what. So maybe one person's job is to design a flyer, and another person's job is to pass out those flyers, and another person's job is to get a group of people together and go talk to your state representative or whatever. But so you're gonna split up the work among your group, give everybody an assignment, and then have timelines so that you know when each piece of the plan is going to be completed. Then carrying out the strategy is the next step, and we'll talk about collective responsibility and collective action. Collective responsibility is where people in your group all work together as a team and hold each other accountable so that everybody knows what everybody else is doing and you're all working towards the same goal. And then collective action is when all of these things that you're doing, you know, passing out flyers or sending emails or signing petitions or, you know, holding a press conference, whatever it is, you're doing these all together. That's collective action. That's when a big group of people gets together and takes action toward the same goal. The other important part of carrying out your strategy is staying flexible, because as things change, you need to be able to change with them. So maybe partway through your campaign, there's a big state budget crisis, and the amount of funding available for public transit goes down dramatically. And so instead of asking for $1 million, you're going to ask for something else because you're responding to changing conditions. And then keeping good communication between team members. You know, obviously if your group is going to work well together, you need to be talking to each other and everybody needs to know what everyone else is doing. And then at the very end of your campaign, you're going to evaluate your strategy after the campaign is over. You're going to talk about what worked and what didn't work and how you could do better in the future. And the reason you do that is so that the next time you organize something, you will have learned something and you can do a better job next time around and hopefully avoid making the same mistakes you did the first time. So let's move on. We're going to talk in a little bit more detail about identifying your issue and the difference between issues and problems. So we talked a little bit about how problems are individual and personal and specific, and issues are systemic and they affect groups of people. So just looking through this chart really quickly, an example of a problem is, I couldn't finish the test in the time we were given. I suck. I should probably just drop this class. It's too hard for me. Now, taking that same problem and framing it as an issue would be to look at what's the bigger picture. Is this really this person's fault, this student who can't finish the test on time? Or is it that the Disability Services Office doesn't help students with disabilities understand what kinds of accommodations we can request, including additional time on tests or different testing formats. So instead of putting the blame on the individual and the responsibility on the individual to solve the problem, it's looking at the system that creates the problem. And here the system is the Disability Services Office at the college campus. The next example of a problem is I use a wheelchair and the train station nearby isn't elevator equipped. Now I have to take 2 buses to get to work and my commute is much longer. So we already kind of talked through this one, but to define that one as a problem, the Public Transit Administration doesn't provide train stations that are accessible for people with disabilities. So the burden to fix the problem is on the system, not on the individual person who is having this long commute. The last example here of a problem, my state has a huge wait list for Medicaid funded support services. I'm just going to have to pay for my support services myself in order to get them. So that's an individual problem, and that's a person thinking about an individual solution. Now, if you look at that as an issue, you see that the system that's causing that problem is that the state government doesn't have enough funding for its disability support service programs. And so the way you would attack that is you would look at, funding on a statewide level, or there's a lot of different ways you could go about it, but you're looking at the system and you're defining the issue in a way that affects a lot of other people. If you develop your campaign strategy around a problem, you would only win for one person or a small group of people. But if you develop a strategy around an issue, it means you're fighting for bigger change that will help a large group of people. And it also means you're going to be able to engage a lot more people in fighting or in organizing to make change. Because if you just say, this is just about my commute, maybe you'll get your very best friends and family to want to help you with that. But if you say, this is about public transit for everybody in the city who uses a wheelchair, there's going to be lots more people who are going to be willing to help you out with that. So that's the difference between problems and issues. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about what makes a good campaign issue. There's a couple of factors to think about. One of them is that it's compelling and timely. So that means it's widely and deeply felt and commands attention. It's something that a lot of people care about. There's the potential to affect a large number of people and the potential to engage a large number of people into action. We kind of just talked about that on the last slide. Specific and achievable. There's clear and specific gains to be made whether the issue is immediately winnable or not. So that means even if you can't get everything you want, even if you can't get a completely 100% accessible public transit system for the entire city, maybe it's possible to win on some smaller piece of that. Maybe you can get funding to retrofit one train station, or maybe you can get a commitment to fund this in the future or whatever. Think about what are other ways to claim victory on this issue. That you can state your issue in one simple sentence with a clear and specific solution. That's really important because when you're trying to get people to join your group and help organize with you, you need to be able to explain in one sentence why we're fighting, why we're organizing. We have the power and resources to win the issue. So, if your issue is too big and too broad and too ambitious, like we're going to end world poverty this year, or we're going to achieve world peace, it's too big, it's too complicated to organize around, and it's not something that your group can win. So you want to think through, is this something we can win? Do we have the power and the resources? There should be a clear-cut target or decision makers. So that means you need to know, if you're organizing on a college campus, who makes the decisions about funding disability services, or who makes the decisions about public transit or about Medicaid in your state's funding for support services. You need to know who your target is. And so in choosing your issue, you need to know that there is a specific person who is a target. A target is never a group of people or an institution, so you wouldn't want to target a state agency or a whole board of people. You want to target literally one human being with a name and a face and an email address, because that's how you're going to figure out how to put pressure on someone. Let's see what else. We can get organized within a time frame that we control. So then again, that's about sort of keeping your goals achievable. Not something that's going to take you 20 years to do, because the people in your group probably aren't going to stick around for 20 years. You have to have some intermediate victory you can win before you get there. And we have the power to frame the issue for group members, potential allies, the campus or community, and the media. So that's sort of thinking about who are the other people that you're going to want to draw in to help you organize around this issue. Does it just affect people in your group? Does it affect people in a certain neighborhood? Does it affect, can you find allies in your community? And how are you going to talk about your issue with the media? The third bullet point is that the issue should build your organization. So whether you win or lose this issue, the process of organizing around it and educating people about it should make your organization stronger. And if it's an issue that sort of fits with your group's mission statement and strategy, that will almost always be true. Even if you don't succeed in getting an elevator installed in this particular transit station, if you succeed in educating a bunch of people about accessibility in public transit, or if you succeed in building coalitions with other allied groups who may help you in the future, or if you succeed in bringing new people into your group who are interested in organizing, then you've won something. You've built your organization, even if you don't win on that specific issue. So you want to build your organization's membership, which means getting more people into your group, and you also want to build your leadership, which means the people in your group have gotten experience doing things and winning things and being better organizers. An issue should give you opportunities to educate members, allies, and the community. So we talked about that, spreading information about your issue so that more people understand it. And it should be an issue that unifies you rather than a divisive issue, and an issue that brings a large group of people together and helps find common ground. Then the fourth bullet point under what makes a good issue is that it promotes our organization's long-term values, vision, and strategy for change. So winning on a particular issue is an immediate step toward our long-term goals for systemic change. So that means that the issue should address the root cause of the problem rather than just the symptoms. So going back to the transit example, if we took just the problem of this one person has this super long commute to get to work, and instead of looking at the root cause, which was that this train station was inaccessible, we said, well, we could solve this problem if we got this one person a wheelchair accessible van and we got a driver to drive that person to work every day. That would fix the problem for that one person's commute, but it wouldn't move the organization forward, and it wouldn't change anything for anybody else. So we want to pick an issue that's going to move the whole organization forward and that's going to be in line with our vision and values, which is that everybody should have access to public transit, that we're not just about solving a problem for one person. And then the last thing under that one is that it raises consciousness and promotes messages about problems and solutions both internally and externally. And that basically just means pick an issue that meshes with your organization's mission statement. If you're an organization that works for disability justice, you want to pick an issue that is in line with that and not an issue that's totally unrelated to your organization's mission. Okay. The next section is about power analysis, and there's two pieces to this, and one of them is their power and one of them is our power. And so when I'm talking about them and us, the they is your target. So in the example of public transit, the they that you're organizing around is maybe the transit authority, or maybe it's the county government, or who, some government official who's responsible, who has the ability to make the decision. So there's a whole list of questions here, and I'm not going to read through every single one of these because you'll get this as a handout. But the basic thing, you don't have to answer every single question on this handout. It's a really long list. But if you can answer some of these, it will get your group thinking about who are these targets that we're trying to influence to get the decision that we want. What are they all about? Who are the decision makers? How are they organized? Where do they get their money? Who are their clients? Do they care about their public image? Who are their allies? What other groups or organizations might affect them? And so you're trying to learn everything you possibly can about this person, this elected leader or public official or whoever it is who has the ability to give you what you want. So that's the section on their power, and then there's a section called our power, but I can't get the slide to move here. Sorry, hold on a second. There it is. Okay. So our power, you're basically then going to do the same analysis on your own group. Who are we, this group that's organizing? What is our community? What other groups might share our concerns? What resources do we have? How much people power do we have? Do we have any money? Do we have, what do we do well? What do we not do well? What else is happening in the community that could impact this fight? So again, you don't have to answer every single question on this page, but if you sit down with your group and you think through what do we bring to the table and what does our target have, then that helps you sort of think through where are the areas that we are strong and they're weak. You know, maybe you figure out that your group is really strong on people power. You can get a lot of people to volunteer to do stuff. And their group, you know, maybe has a lot more money than you do, but they can't like motivate 40 people to go out knocking on doors or making phone calls or whatever. So that's how you start figuring out what your leverage is. And again, you'll get this as a handout so that you can look at it in more detail. The next section is about identifying targets. So a target is always a person. It's never an institution or an elected body. So again, if you target like a board or an agency or something, you're really not going to be able to figure out a strategy for how to move a whole board. You have to pick one person and come up with a strategy about how you're going to move that individual person. So we think about targets as primary targets and secondary targets. Your primary target is who has the power to give you what you want. You know, if you're organizing, again, going back to this train station example, like who is the person who literally is going to write the check to pay for the elevator in that train station? Who is the elected official who's going to make the decision to fund accessibility in public transit? And then what power do you have over them? And that's that whole power analysis. That's thinking through how can you move them to do what you want. Your secondary targets are who has power over the people with the power to give you what you want. So if we're talking about public transit again, we might think about, okay, so there's a head official of the Public Transit Authority, and he's an elected official, so people in your city vote on the head of the Public Transit Authority. So the voters are maybe your secondary targets. If he has to run for office next time, you would have potentially the possibility of not getting him elected if he doesn't do what you want him to do. And that's the what power do you have over them. And sometimes it's, you know, it's not that simple. Sometimes it's like, the official who has the power to give you what you want has a boss, or they maybe they own a business and they have clients, and so you have to think about who are all the people who influence them. And I think we have a handout on that also, sort of mapping out the sort of web of influence of all the different people or institutions or organizations who might influence your targets. So the next section is understanding your resources. Your power analysis should give you a clearer picture of what resources your group has, and resources could be volunteers, they could be experience or leadership skills, it could be paid staff, it could be money. You know, maybe you have a dues fund or a pot of money that you can use to work on this campaign. What your strong points are, what your network of potential supporters looks like. So that's all of those questions in that power analysis are going to help you understand what you bring to the table and what resources you have to work on this campaign. Once you have a clear idea of who your targets are and what resources you have, then you're ready to start working on your action plan for addressing your issue. And so for the rest of the presentation, we're going to focus on actually making an action plan. So this section is about setting SMART goals, and SMART is an acronym, S-M-A-R-T. It stands for specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely. And so we'll talk about each of those. But when you set a goal, you want to think through each of those 5 things and make sure that your goal fits all those criteria. So specific. Your goal should be specific and concrete. It's easier to create strategies if your goal is specific. For example, maybe your local news media aired a story depicting people with disabilities negatively. A specific goal could be addressing this particular harmful media representation. Measurable. After setting a specific goal, you'll need to create a way to measure the progress of the action you're trying to accomplish. You want to be able to evaluate concrete ways that you're moving forward. For example, Let's say your group is trying to combat a specific instance of harmful media representation of disability locally. Some concrete ways you could measure your progress would be if you're getting media attention, or if the entity like the news station or the reporter or whoever who created the harmful media agrees to meet with you. That's a measurable part of your goal. You can say, check off a box, either yes or no, this happened or it didn't happen. Attainable. You should set goals that are attainable. So your group can't get rid of harmful media representation everywhere in the world, but it could strive to make gradual, small changes with regards to media representation. So trying to correct one particular issue is an attainable goal. Saying that you want to, change the way that media is used all over the world all at once by tomorrow is not an attainable goal. Realistic. Is your goal realistic for your group? Is the size of the project manageable for your group? How interested is your group in working on the issue? So that's going to be, again, sort of comparing the resources that you have with the size and scope of your goal. And then timely. Can your group take action on this issue quickly, where not necessarily quickly, but in a reasonable time frame? If you're working with a student group and students are on campus from, say, September to December, and then they're on campus again from January until June, but there's no way you're going to make any progress on this issue until like next year, then maybe that's not a great issue for a student group, because you're not going to make progress in a time frame that's meaningful for the people who are working on the project. Another example would be working on a local or state issue when you have a state budget that's on a 2-year cycle. And if your goal is to get funding for a particular thing the next time the state budget is coming up for consideration, can you make enough progress on this before the budget comes up for deliberation again that you could actually make a change? So again, SMART stands for specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely. And that's a really good way to think through each goal that you set on your campaign to see if it's a well thought out goal. So the next part of making an action plan is determining your ask. Your goals will help you determine what your ask is. What are you asking your targets to do? So a good ask should be short and memorable so that people can repeat it. Should be specific enough that a win is measurable. Realistic enough that your targets can do it. Have a clear manner of implementation, so how exactly is it going to happen? Have a clear, non-arbitrary deadline for implementation. So an example of a good ask would be, we want you to write a check for $100,000 to install this elevator by September 5th. So you've got a very specific way you want it to happen. You've got a date that you want it to happen by. It's very clear what you want them to do. Then the last part of it is have a clear and compelling justification for why it's important. So you can't just ask them to do it. You have to explain why it matters and why people care about it. So tactics. We talked a little bit about tactics before. Tactics are the specific steps in carrying out the strategy. Here's a list of just some examples of tactics. There are hundreds and hundreds of other possible tactics, and I think you'll get a list with ideas on the materials that will be available next week. So one example, if you're working with a student group on campus, would be demanding that your school divest from corporations that work against your cause, occupying the offices of a politician, a public agency, or a campus administration, hijacking a media event that your target organized with the intention of using it for your own purposes, a poll or a referendum. So developing a question like, should the university spend $50,000 to do an accessibility audit, and then polling 200 people and publicizing the results. Submitting testimony to a Senate committee is a tactic. Popular education, holding a seminar or a teach-in or speaking to your local community group about your campaign. A stunt or street theater or a flash mob, a public stunt that's creative, visually appealing, and newsworthy. It's a good way to get media coverage and to educate people about your issue. Visiting a local politician with members of your group. So these are all examples of tactics, and obviously there's lots more, and you'll get some more of those on the handouts that you get next week. So you've got all these different tactics you can choose from. How do you decide which tactics are the ones that are appropriate for your particular campaign or to move your particular target? So for each target, you're going to list a couple of tactics that you think will work best to make your power felt. In your power analysis, you should have identified who the key targets are and what their pressure points are. So pressure points are sort of their weaknesses. You know, does this person really, really care about their public image? And if so, maybe their pressure point is bad press. Like if you can get the media to point out bad things about them, then that would be a pressure point. If it's an elected official, their pressure point might be, you know, voters and putting pressure on them so that campaigning for their opponent in the next election would be putting pressure on them. So a tactic has to have context. It has to align with and reinforce your broader strategy. A flash mob or an occupation might sound cool, but wouldn't carry much weight if it doesn't directly tie into your campaign. It has to be flexible and creative. So you have to plan a lot of different tactics and be able to adapt to changing circumstances. You need backup plans and then more backup plans for those. You should be prepared and have enough tactics ready that you can change what you're doing right away if circumstances change. So if you, for example, make a plan that you're going to pass out flyers because, let's say you're trying to pressure this elected official, this head of the transit authority, and you hear that he's going to be speaking downtown at some conference. And so you're going to go to the conference and show up with a bunch of people and pass out flyers in front of it about your issue. And you've got it all planned and you show up and then it turns out that his speech was canceled and he's not even going to be there that day. So, you know, do you go ahead and pass out the flyers anyway, or do you come up with a backup plan? You have a backup plan ahead of time and figure out what your other tactic is going to be. So that's about staying flexible. Being directed at a specific target. Your tactics are more effective because if they're directed at a specific target because it forces the target to make the choice to either respond or not respond. If your tactic is directed, let's say, at an entire board of like 8 people, then your target can just ignore it and say, well, it wasn't really directed at me and nobody else on the board responded either. But if your target is directed at a specific person and that person is named, then they have to either respond or not respond, and then that's, you know, making a decision also. And it has to be backed up by a specific form of power. So that means that it has to have a reasonable chance of success or of impact. And so in order to ensure this, you have to know exactly what resources you're putting behind any given tactic. For example, if you don't have a whole bunch of people working on your campaign, saying that you're going to have a march that's going to block off a whole bridge as a tactic, it isn't going to work so well. And one of the things on the tactics handout is there are certain tactics that you only need 1 or 2 people to pull it off effectively, and there are other tactics that you really need, you know, 100 people to make this thing work. And so if you don't have 100 people, you should probably choose something else. So that's sort of matching tactics to your resources and to the pressure points of your target. Okay, these next 2 pages are just some sort of examples of worksheets or charts that you can use to help put together your strategy or your action plan. One example, so after you decide when you want to achieve your goal, then you're going to create a timeline and assign tasks. The best way to develop your timeline is to start at your end goal and to think backwards through each step to get there. You want to make sure all of your tasks are SMART, so that means that they meet those criteria we talked about earlier, and that there's a clear delegation of who needs to do what and when. So this first chart is the example of maybe you're planning for an action like a rally or a march or an event, and you would start at the bottom of the chart with the day of the action, and you would list out specifically the tasks that need to be done on that day and who will do them. And then you would work backward from there all the way back up to the present date, which is today, and figure out what tasks need to happen, you know, along the way to get to that point. And this will be one of the charts that's passed out with the rest of the materials. This is another example of a planning chart where you write your goal up at the top. In the first column, you write your timeline, so you say when you want to achieve the goal. In the second column, you list your action steps and your tactics, so what has to happen to achieve the goal. These are the individual steps, and you would have this chart running down your whole page, so you could put, you know, 5 steps or 10 steps or whatever. And then resources. What resources do you have and what resources do you need? So if the tactic is, say, passing out leaflets, you need people to show up to do that. You need paper to print them on. You need somebody to design and write the flyer and produce it. You need to decide where you're going to pass out the flyers. All of those things are part of the action steps and the tactics and the resources. Natalia, I think I lost the mouse here because I can't get this to move to the next slide.
Sorry, is it working now? Hold on.
Oh, yep, I got it now. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. So carrying out the campaign strategy. So once you've done all this planning and you've figured out what your issue is and who your targets are and what your tactics are and your goals, then you have to actually do this stuff. You carry out the strategy. So this is about collective action and collective responsibility. So taking collective action by working together to accomplish the tasks is essential to carrying out a successful campaign. Your strategy is going to run much smoother if your group works as a team toward the same goals. In order to take successful collective action, the group has to have collective responsibility. So everybody has to be responsible for the tasks they've been assigned to do and to do them on time. And collective responsibility means you're holding each other accountable. You know that if you don't do your job, that other people in the group are going to know about it and are going to have to pick up the slack. And so you're accountable to them. Having SMART goals applies not only to the broader goals of the campaign, but for individual members as well. So being realistic about your limits and abilities is part of collective responsibility. That means don't take on a task alone that you won't be able to accomplish by yourself. At the same time, collective responsibility also means that you can't leave all of the work for someone else to do. Everyone in the group has to participate and contribute for your strategy to work. Oh, I'm sorry. I will slow down if I am going too fast. Sorry if I'm rushing through this. So collective action and collective responsibility are the two things that we talked about for carrying out the campaign strategy. We're going to talk about a couple of other things that are important in carrying out the strategy. The first one is communication. So during all the steps of planning and executing the strategy, your group needs to have clear lines of communication. So that means that everybody in the group should know what everybody else is responsible for and what the strategy is. If you need to shift tactics or set new deadlines, everybody needs to know and be on the same page. So establishing regular check-ins with the group members during a campaign will help make sure that you're all working toward the same goals throughout the entire process. So that means you need to all be talking to each other. You should all have regular meetings or regular check-ins. It can't just be one person, one leader who's making all the decisions and doing all the work. Everybody has to be communicating. Evaluation. Everything worth doing is worth evaluating. So after every action, and especially after the conclusion of a campaign, you want to get together with your group and discuss what worked well and what you could do better next time. You're going to evaluate your process, your outcomes, and your impact, and we'll talk about each of those. So it's really important to evaluate every time you can evaluate tactics. So if you do a rally or an action or a leaflet or a petition, you could evaluate just that tactic, but also you evaluate your entire campaign. So if you work for 6 months to try to get something to happen and you finally achieve it, then you want to take some time to sit back and reflect and evaluate how that worked, how your group worked together. So process evaluations look at the planning and development of your campaign. How well did we communicate with each other? What could we do better? What tools did we use to plan our strategy? Were they effective? Did we give ourselves enough time to plan our actions? How well were tasks delegated? Outcome evaluations look at the changes that have happened as a result of your campaign. So how many people signed our petitions? How many legislators said they would support our bill? How many people attended our educational event? That looks at outcomes. And then impact evaluations look at deeper long-term changes that your campaign could have produced. So how has our campaign affected the perception of disability rights in our area? What new relationships could we draw on for future support? How has this campaign helped our group develop? You could also look at how has the campaign helped individual members of the group develop their leadership. Have you developed new skills? Does your group work better together? So those are the 3 different pieces that you want to evaluate after your campaign: process, outcome, and impact. And again, I think that those will be on the handout as well. Oh, and I guess that was the last slide. So I think then it's opened up for questions. Is that right, Natalia?
Hi everyone. Yes, this would be our question and answer component. I'm only seeing two. Hold on. Yes, let me just look through the questions quickly and see which ones I can answer quickly, and then I'll shift that over to you, Sarah. Hold on.
Okay.
Okay, so I think somebody had a question about when would the content of this information, the slides would be made available. The written resource, basically summarizing all of the content that was provided today, will be made available next week. Now, specifically the handouts, my understanding is that that will be part of the campaign strategy toolkit. But yeah, so basically the general advocacy strategies written resource will be made available next week, and then with the campaign strategy toolkit to be made available in January. The templates and the handouts that Sarah was describing will be made available. Let's see. So does anybody have any questions? I don't see any other questions. So feel free to type in any questions in the question category. I think we have about 10 minutes for questions. Let's see. So Sarah, it appears that we don't really have questions at the moment. Is it okay if we close the session?
Sure.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us for our last webinar for fall. And yep, and thank you, Sarah, for agreeing to present today.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thanks. Bye.